preachers and church folks to begin to deal with reframing the dialogue on race. Now, what does that mean? First of all, I want to be clear, and I'm going to just go hash through a little of this, but I want to be clear that it's not a picture frame. We're not talking about putting a new picture frame on an old picture. No, it is about building a new frame, like a frame for a house. And as we know that in the frame for a house, foundation is a part of the frame. So we decided that we would reframe this dialogue from the ground up. Now, the old frame was based on a theory that integration of Black folks into white culture was in fact the way to go. This would be the effort to move forward, that we would be about the business of cleaning up white culture and getting Black folks into white culture. Well, we all know that the white culture is corrupt. I mean, the white culture is what propagated the slavery, what propagated the segregation, what propagated all of the problems we had. So why would you want to just re-enter another culture, a corrupt culture? And even the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution belie this, as we know that they say all men are created equal, but yet went on to put in the Constitution that only white landowning men could vote, which didn't make much sense. But what happened was that the project emerged and began to hold conferences to recruit predominantly white preachers and white churches. It was an effort to do this. Now, what happened is that we came up with some principles. The first was we would hold seminars around the country. The first was to review the history of white supremacy in America and the efforts to integrate the cultural and social institutions of America, to review that, to rewrite the history of America. The history is woefully corrupt. And hence tonight, we have Cornel Pewewardy, a great historian who is going to talk to us about rewriting history. And the history needs to be truly rewritten, to bring the issue of race and white supremacy into the therapeutic setting. This is the third one. The therapeutic setting for Black folks, if you came in and you were dealing with your identity issues in therapy, one of the first things you said was you were defined by your race. You were Black in America. This went a long way to define you by your race. White people never talked about being defined by whiteness. And we decided that the therapeutic setting needed to have a white to check this out. I mean, to find out how whiteness makes us broken. The fourth thing was to frame a dialogue on reparations as a condition for racial reconciliation, because the damage that had been done by slavery, by the institution of racism and Jim Crow, the damage that had been done by the culture of racism the damage done had to be what am I looking for? Had to be repaired. And then fifthly, as I said, coming in, we were going to build a community of support and dialogue for those committed to reframing the dialogue on race in America. Unfortunately, Dr. Jones passed away at a very early age, and unfortunately, I retired. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, but the notion is that reframing did not evolve into that community of churches that we had hoped that it would evolve into. So that's kind of the basis of it. The historical, the rewriting of American history, the souls of white folks, and what whiteness affects, how it affects us, healing and repair and reparations, building community and congregational strategies was our effort to try to get something done on reframing the dialogue on race in America. Now, tonight is the second. The first night we laid this out and we had a big discussion about it. But tonight is the second in a series, and we're going to close the series with reparations. And we're going to try to make a project available. We will not deal with the therapeutic and the story of whiteness and what it does to the personality of white people, being white in America, what that does. And so tonight we're going to deal with rewriting history. Hence, we have with us a great historian in his own rights, and a great fighter, in my mind, for liberty and freedom. He has been a leader in the mascot. We all know about how the athletic teams in America, professional, high school, and college, have taken over mascots of Native Americans and denigrated them to make them to have a showtime at halftime. But the Native icons and the Native artifacts have been used, including our own Kansas City football team. We need to get it. We need to get that changed. I'm proud to say that Kansas City, when it all began to organize around this, they met in St. Mark's Church. Hallelujah. Met in St. Mark's Church. So that's the, if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer the questions. But tonight we have we're going on to deal with rewriting U.S. history. Now, before we do that, though, God is so good. A book has just now come out that is pertinent to this, and it's a history book, and it talks about a man by the name of Denmark Vesey. The title of it is Denmark Vesey's Bible by Jeremy Schipper, Schipper. The thwarted revolt that put slavery and scripture on trial. The church has been a primary player in this whole denigration of people who are not white. Okay, that's the end of. We won't have this again, but I thought maybe there may be some folks that came in tonight that might want to know about it. If you want to know more about this, you can give me a call. But Cornel, good evening to you, my brother.
Good to see you. Good to see you.
I'm going to turn this over to you and let the introductions come through the bio that we have up there about you. I hope it's accurate. And if there anything you want to ask me or say anything, if not, carry on, my brother.
Well, I want to say thank you, Marawi, Tivitachat in the Comanche language. I'm very pleased. Tech Sample give me a shout out and to introduce Sam Mann. Sam Mann, I appreciate the introduction and the bio and the things that they're about. I'd like to first acknowledge the land that I'm upon for the Comanche, the Kiowa, and the Apache, whose land, traditional land that we have in Southwest Oklahoma, where many people live, many people make their work, and we go to school here. But I wanted to acknowledge the original allottees, the people that have traveled this land from the get-go, and that's the Comanche, the Kiowa, and Apache. So that's my land acknowledgement. And Brother Sam Mann and I go back decades. Of course, when I was a young professor there at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, so we collaborated on many topics and issues of social justice. And we're still together to this day in our retirement. So I'm in retirement, but going on 5 years now at a Portland State University, where I was a professor and chair of Indigenous Studies. Prior to that, I'd make numerous stops along the way, first entering the academy at the University of Kansas and the schools of education, and where I became an associate professor there and curriculum and instruction. So the context of my talk is framed mostly as an educator. And so the script that I have comes from the book that we wrote years ago, 2005, from the School of American Research Press. It's called For Indigenous Eyes Only. And the chapter that I'm referring to is the one that I wrote, which is the context of my talk, which is the ideology, power, and the miseducation of Indigenous peoples in the United States. And so I'll be accenting what I mean by miseducating, because if you go to school in the United States, whether public school, private, most likely, if you're Native, if you're Indigenous, or you're First Nations, you have been miseducated by the educational systems. And so it takes almost a whole lifetime, decades of unlearning to the point that you get to identify your own culture and your own history and the knowledge base that we have. And so that's pretty much the part of my life, and I wanted to share that with you. The context of my talk is just a summary of that chapter, and I call it Rewriting History, an Indigenous people's retelling of history of the Americas. And so rewriting history from an Indigenous perspective, it requires documenting the fighting spirit and ongoing resistance of Indigenous peoples to 500 years of genocide, massacres, torture, rape, displacement, and forced assimilation, a necessity, an antidote to the conventional history of the Americas. So that's what I mean by being miseducated, because we didn't know about all these things that have happened to us. So the objective of my talk is to explore the reasons behind the construction of a colonial Indian education by briefly explaining the views, the politics, and the practices of white policymakers who funded, they created, and they justified and refined colonial educational policies upon Indigenous peoples in this country. Ultimately, a manufactured romantic image of Indigenous peoples has been used to justify the control of entire tribal communities. More specifically, white policymakers of Indian education represented the interest of settler colonial expansion. White policymakers of Indian education designed educational strategies to foster the ideology of white supremacy. Even in our contemporary fight today for critical race theory in public schools and institutions of higher education, The empire strikes back with state laws prohibiting teaching and learning from critical race theory. The history of Indian boarding schools in this country can provide a brief start, an overview of the political forces on schools, and set the context for neoliberalism and the manifestations of Christian hegemony. Early Indian boarding schools have been used historically as educational instruments to ensure settler colonial domination through miseducation. The American educational system promoted a system maintaining curriculum that perpetuates oppression through the strict control of all aspects of home living and the adoption of official curricula. Students need to know that settler colonial education and practices and philosophy are still supported by the dominant educational power structure in this country. For example, most K-12 schools in this country have been consistent in their original design, graduating students with a value system that has basically 4 domains. Number one, if you graduate from a public school, the value system is more likely going to be very Eurocentric, very individualistic, very competitive, and then last, number 4, is materialistic. So that occurred in my lifetime when I graduated from high school in 1970. And that has not changed much. And here it is, 2022. And many of the value systems of a public school are still the same: Eurocentric, individualistic, competitive, and materialistic. And the reason I say that, that is not the holistic value system of teaching and learning for Indigenous people and many other people, ethnic groups around the globe. Historically, most Indigenous people have encountered a Machiavellian model of teaching and learning. Attempts to defeat Indigenous people were not so much by military force, but by politically restructuring the system of education to mold a settler colonial belief system. Settler colonialism that imprisons young minds with the concept of racial or ethnic inferiority is by far more tyrannical than brute force. As an outgrowth of explorers' observation and the deductions by some European philosophers, a concept emerged circa 1730 that argued that although nature is created innocent, all things degenerate when touched by civilization. The idea became a double-edged sword for Indigenous peoples in that while the concept suggests inherent evils of so-called civilization, it labels Indigenous peoples as savages, that is, subhuman, then lending them to Eurocentric investigations, measurements, and study. The myth of the noble savage emerged and moderated somewhat the disapproving European attitudes towards Indigenous people in general, but did not prevent most Europeans from maintaining a view of Indigenous peoples as barbaric and liable to genocide. The idea of superior and inferior races that permeated the mainstream American thinking about continental and world mission also often permeated the thinking of the English and the Western Europeans in general by the mid-19th century. Fabricated, civilized, and uncivilized ascribed identities are the result of multidisciplinary academic falsification of the human record. Historians have denied, distorted, and ignored the history of subordinated groups and magnified, embellished, and glorified, even deified the histories of their own people. Western anthropologists fabricated savage and uncivilized people. Theologians in seminaries even debated the existence of whether Indigenous people had souls and were really debating if they were real human beings. Biologists created races, ranks among races. As early educational practices with Indigenous peoples and their students, deculturalization is one aspect of this strange mixture of democratic thought and intolerance that exists in the minds of many Euro-American policymakers. The concept of deculturalization demonstrates how cultural prejudice and religious bigotry can be intertwined with democratic beliefs. The mastery of such settler colonial curriculum by indigenous children who have no knowledge of their tribal identity is merely an advanced form of programmed cultural destruction. Deculturalization combines education for democracy and political equality with cultural genocide, the attempt to destroy cultures and tribal languages. Overall, federal educational programs and policy to educate indigenous people have largely ignored the fact that indigenous people had a sophisticated and powerful educational process prior to the contact of Europeans. The ultimate proof of European superiority was not offered as subjective opinion of personal desire, but scientific fact. 30 years of research in educational anthropology and sociology represent a legacy, a deficit through guided assimilation ideology. And so what I mean by deficit, there's a deficit theory that comes that our children have deficits in learning. And that comes from 30 years of research by our anthropologists and sociologists in the field. Thus, the overall schooling of indigenous people is a shameful history of domination by missionaries and the federal government. Young children forcefully taken from their families, stripped of their culture, and forbidden to speak their tribal language. Passively, they withdrew within the hostile environments of Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools and missionary domiciles. And in Canada, they're reserved. The manufacturing of the history of any group of people causes them to forget their authentic histories. Indigenous people were not ignorant savages or pagans as described in early United States history books. These were negative stereotypical terms and concepts created by European politicians and historians. Many indigenous peoples knew the creation stories from memory and could recite them from various types of ceremony. All were highly educated in their tribal perspective and profoundly spiritual, sharing in the complex culture that had granted survival for thousands of years before 1492. It took a white policymakers of Indian education to construct an educational system unparalleled in the history of the world to erase the tribal memories, to cloud our vision, to impair our hearing, and to impede the operation of critical capacities of indigenous peoples. Once creation stories were lost, indigenous peoples became programmed by white policymakers to follow a pattern of historical life. In general, indigenous peoples need to understand the systematic miseducation of indigenous people. It makes no difference whether indigenous educators are driven by indigenous intellectual self-determination. The only education allowable was education for pacification, servitude, and inferiorization. Teachers who want to teach indigenous students must have an agenda for the transformation of indigenous people based on sound information. To set the agenda, however, we have to ask ourselves these two questions. What happened to the independent indigenous education process as a consequence of disturbance through invasion, colonization, and white supremacist ideology and behavior? The second question, what is the nature of indigenous resistance to domination and interference in the nature of efforts to reconstruct tribal-based systems? In particular, what roles do Western education and socialization play in resistance to oppression and the creation of solidarity? When people are educated to respect the knowledge, the scholarship, and the history and the background of everybody except themselves, then those people are miseducated. It's important to remember that there has been many oppositional voices over the decades. Unfortunately, the miseducation has not ceased. In fact, it has increased, and we are now more highly miseducated than ever we were before. And why do you suppose I say this? Today, the global economic and cultural dominance of Europe and its settler colonies such as Canada, New Zealand, United States is the result of this history of settler colonization. Another indisputable consequence is the fact that throughout the world, Indigenous people suffer the highest rates of poverty, suicide, unshelteredness, violent death, drug abuse, alcohol addiction, disease, imprisonment, dislocation, and possibly the most death by any ethnic group caused by COVID-19. Yet our history also shows our ancestors fought, inflicted many defeats upon European colonial forces. In some regions of the Americas, it took hundreds of years before European control was established. Even today, settler colonial states face ongoing Indigenous resistance. This legacy of resistance can inspire our people to continue to defend their territories and communities against ongoing settler colonial aggression. The United States is currently in the midst of a cultural civil war infused by a counter-revolutionary movement being waged by a full-scale attack against ideas, truth, critical thinking, ethics, and justice. It's a civil war I fought once in my lifetime before it was called civil rights. So if we have to fight the good fight over again, I'm willing to work in solidarity with those individuals, groups, and communities who want justice for all. And the purpose of my talk was to raise the level of historical understanding and warrior spirit among Indigenous peoples and others. When we know and understand this history of repression, we will be better able to fight the good fight in the system it has created. Without a fighting spirit, we will have no will to resist or even survive. And so that's my conclusion of the talk that is framed from my chapter on the miseducation of Indigenous peoples in the United States of America. And I'll stop right there, Brother Sam Mann and colleagues, and I'll go with any questions that you may have to let you know. I did put a couple of books there that talk about some of the context of where I was coming from. My colleague, George Teaker, wrote this book, Missionary Conquest. And of course, my book on unsettling settler colonial education will be out next month, published by Teachers College Press. So I'll stop right there if you have any questions for me or dialogue. Thank you.
Let me start with one, Dr. Pewewardy, just while people are thinking, I guess. You know what really, I think, frightens me in terms of addressing these issues that you raised so very well is that my experience growing up, and I experience it now, is that so many, I'm going to say of us white people, so I don't try to distance myself from this. So many of us white people live so much of our lives separated from that. One of the hardest things I find when I'm working with a group of white folks is getting people, first of all, to acknowledge the things that happen. In some cases, it may not be directly their experience, but it's this inability to see the systemic character of something in which we participate here and now, and the destructive and killing consequences of those things as they're carried out, sometimes beyond our view, sometimes beyond our view. What I'm trying, I'm not trying to counter what you're saying, because I think it's dead right. I'm trying to get at the fact that a lot of white people either can't, we don't have the sensibilities to see it. In some cases, we've not been close to it because we're separated from it. And because I think the whole point of the way we're educated, you know, I lost it in a move. I had my 5th grade education textbook. I found it in a used bookstore and bought it because I had remembered it. The front page, the first page of that textbook said that this was a history of Mississippi. In Mississippi, the relationships between, I think they use the word Negro, and white people has always been one of friendliness and cooperation. I mean, it was simply an outrageous page, but that's the book from which I was taught Mississippi history. So I guess I'm asking for a comment in terms of, one is to raise the level of sensibility and consciousness about the things that go on the one hand, and secondly, to cross some of these walls that have been there where we don't see as directly what happened. I saw a white policeman pistol whip a black man when I was 7 years old. I don't think after that I could ever believe that black folk were treated rightly in my hometown. But I think a lot of people don't have those experiences. I'm not setting them free. That's our responsibility to get next to that. But comment to that. I don't know. I mean, our legislature in Missouri is using this stuff, the miseducation, and raging against, critical race theory and so forth. And they're making political hay with it with some people. And it is the most mindless, I'm going to say it, it's the most mindless crap. I'm talking about what our legislators say. It's the most mindless crap I've seen lately. I don't want to ask a how question. I want to ask you if you'd just comment on that. Maybe that means, where have you been able to cross those sensibilities best? Where have you been able to move past those walls? Am I clear?
Yeah, let me respond this way. Thank you so much for your inquiry, Tex. I think that because of my training as a teacher, an elementary teacher, and then administrator, and then a professor in teacher education, I began to understand teaching and learning theory. And now that I'm here, we just opened up our charter school it's called the Comanche Academy. So we're taking back the education of our own people, and we're starting with the little ones, and we're teaching them with the state standards here in Oklahoma, like everybody else, but we're doing it with a Comanche-based pedagogy, and also using our language in a dual language methodology approach, because we do not have fluent speakers that much. We can only go with the dual language, which is a combination of English and Comanche, but move into that direction. So we're starting with the littles, and then we're building up. So that's taking back. But my research is framed what I call Indigenous resurgence theory, which is a concept that embraces critical race theory, but it more looks at self-determination and how I'm engaging into our own knowledge base and what we're able to do. But so I have to go back, and that's the reason I said that Prior to 1492, we had our own educational systems that worked. They were culturally responsive, and that, you know, we didn't have standardized tests. We didn't measure each other's mental capacity. I mean, that was craft wisdom of knowledge of the elders. We didn't see the birds and the bears and all the four-legged and their mama bears or papa bears. They didn't go try to measure each of their babies' mental capacity and give them standardized tests. They always do what they always did, what works, and it was culturally appropriate. So we're following that basal of teaching and learning that is imported from Europe. And so that has not worked for a lot of people, and especially indigenous people, because it created a soul wound, SOUL, a soul wound by the Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding schools. And because our children were taken from the reservations, states, 3 or 4 states away, in these boxcart rail trains, and put into these old abandoned army forts that nobody used. And that's what created the first boarding schools. And those kids, they probably didn't go home every weekend. None of them went home for 2 or 3 years. And so what we're finding now is there are so many burial remains in these old boarding schools of these deaths of these children because they couldn't go home. Many of them got sick. Some were so depressed they ran away. We didn't find them until the spring when the snow and the ice melted. And so they were reburied. And so that soul wound is happening again because we're uncovering all these grave sites from these children that that were forced to go to these boarding schools, that were taught by the pastors and the priests. I mean the nuns. And so that caused a soul wound into this generation. I call it is intergenerational grieving, because you know what happens. Just last night, case in point, that we have children that are going to our kindergarten, our first grade, and preschool that are speaking Comanche, and they're going home and talking to their own families and their adults, and they don't even understand because they went to a public school system that did not affirm their language or even have that available. And so the littles are teaching their parents and grandparents how to speak our language. But that's what I meant by resurgence, coming back and saving our people using the school system, the very culprit, which is a double-edged sword. On one side of the sword is sharp enough to destroy your language and culture. On the other side, we have today indigenous resurgence theory using schooling and education to save the language and save the culture in rebuilding our nation. So if that's any help. But I did say in there, my second page, that settler colonialism that imprisons young minds with the concept of racial or ethnic inferiority is by far more tyrannical than brute force, because it's psychologically damaging. That's why we have so much social ills today, because it was forced upon us systematically using these school systems. And so now we're recovering through all the things that we're doing with finding these grave sites. And then we're looking at so many of our women. There's a national movement called Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women today. And they're disappearing, and a lot of people don't know. And so that is it's a tragedy. And so as we look at all those social ills on top of the pandemic that we're having with COVID-19, we're probably the ones that have the most deaths because of our communal living styles. So that's very fearful. So I know I went into a long spiel about trying to respond to your inquiry, but those things I had to learn. It took me a lifetime to learn that. That's why I'm so adamant in reaching back into the educational systems to help rebuild it.
That's helpful. Thank you. Let's turn to others who have comments or questions by now, I would think.
Sam has a question. Go ahead, Sam.
Cornel, can you hear me?
Yes.
What is the strategy for countering this genocide by education and cultural tyranny? What are the strategies? What do we do?
Well, I think that I mean, just Brother Sam, just by posing that question is the elevation of consciousness, because many people won't know what to do, or they won't have a question to even ask. They'll just do whatever they've always done, and you'll get what you always got. And so just by making that inquiry, because we're people of consciousness, particularly those of us that admire and dedicate our lives to being educated beyond the generations of those that did not have that opportunity. You know, that's why I revel in the camaraderie of this group right here, and we're able to work and just talk about, you know, the issues of reparations within Indigenous peoples. And so, you know, some of the first steps is just to acknowledge the wrongness that has happened, and then to move forward. How do we fix this? Well, so many times it's just like in elementary school, you just say, I'm sorry, what can I do? But just not let bygones be bygones. Let's help rebuild. How do we patch up? How do we make amends? What can we do in our atonement? What reconciliation can we do together so we don't repeat the past? Because that's the worst thing can happen. You know, Paulo Freire said, you know, when the oppressed become the oppressor, we haven't learned anything. And we're repeating the same sins of the generations. But I don't want to do that. I'm inheriting a very damaged system, and education was the culprit. So now I'm trying to use the other side of the sharpened sword of critical thinking, and trying to collectively put myself in communities that are healthy and able to have these conversations in a safe place, but not be destroyed by hatred of those that don't want us to even have this conversation. And so those are public places. And then I'm living in a state that doesn't want to hear this conversation at all. I'm living in the state of Oklahoma, which is, you know, 39 nations, sovereign nations right here. And it's a Choctaw word called the land of the red people, Oklahoma. So, you know, even at that, you can begin to unfold the reason, and we could learn more and more about ourselves and then teach one another. Because as an administrator, I go to the school officials, superintendents, and presidents and say, you know, you could learn a lot from Indigenous leadership if we work together. We can talk about healing, we can talk about reparation, we can talk about reconciliation, and then move together. But one thing for sure, that we have to honor each other's sovereignty. So we can dance together, but we can be respectful, and the things that we do, we can be different, but still work together.
You have like a resource or know of something where we can find, let's say, who may have like owned particularly well, maybe own is not the right word, but like lived on the land of an area, like for example, trying to find the space that our church sits on and maybe working towards some like reconciliation there?
Yeah, actually, there's some websites that you could go to today that would look at tribal land, just the United States, and I'll try to find that. But you know what I could do also, Matt, there's a video. I don't know if I have it, but it's called Two Rivers, like two rivers, and it's a video. It's quite dated, but what it is that it's a story of a rural community in southern Washington state, where white folks come together and have reunions and things like that, and their children who went off to college. They come back and they're re-educating their parents and the communities of all the things that they learned. And they bring back their friends to introduce them, and their friends are very very ethnic and they're making allies, and they come back and they're talking about kind of the question that you have. They begin to think, wow, I wonder then whose land are we on? And then you go out and you make, research questions, you ask people, go to the library, or in the case of this story called Two Rivers, they find some indigenous or native peoples in the community and start to ask those questions. But of course, the ambivalence comes from the phobia that the native people start to think, uh-oh, why are they coming to ask us questions that they never come to us before? And now they want our knowledge, they want our friendship. What's going on? So there's a big division of trust that has not happened, and all of a sudden they want to know it. But the short story is the native community does come. It tells the story about their geographical space. They come together, they make amends, they start to have conversation. First thing, in the church, it got so big that it moved and morphed into the community center. And then it got so big, they made a festival out of it. And then their story got integrated into the local public schools. And so every year they have a reconciliation celebration and ceremony. To me, that is a beautiful start to reconciliation. If any community would like to know, whose original lands that was, and they reach out to that community. So I would recommend that, because that's my CD when I share with my student. It's called Two Rivers. I'll put it in the chat box. Does that help, Matt?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's a good starting spot.
Any other questions, Tex or anybody?
Yes, I have a question. I'm an old white woman, but pretending that for a moment that I were younger and persuaded, which I am, and wanted to do something for my children, and I lived in your neighborhood. Could I send my child to the Comanche Academy?
Of course. You know, all the charter schools that I'm familiar with in this country are funded by public funds. And so every state department of education has that kind of association. So whether it's a Enrichment Academy public charter school, whether it is a world languages charter school, whether it's a ethnic-based charter school, I think even in Kansas City, there's a lot of ethnic charter schools. The Comanche Charter School is open to everybody. It really, but it just, the difference is the curriculum base, because for us, we designed it to be a Comanche-centered educational curriculum.
No, that's wonderful. I didn't realize it was a charter school.
Yes.
So it seems to me that because there are numerous charter schools around the nation that have some very different foci and maybe very helpful foci for the goals of this conversation, why couldn't we encourage people to send their children to those schools?
Exactly. And so the children would not only learn English, but they would learn, another language other than English. In this our case, it's Comanche. But our fear is that we will not have any more fluent speakers if we don't use our language. So that's why we have an apprentice program, and we have a partnership with the Comanche Language Preservation and Language Committee. So we can grow our own language speakers and then even certify them in our own language. And that's another thing that we have to work out with the state. So like with state certification of world languages, we would move into the same kind of scenario in certifying tribal languages so they can teach within our own school systems.
I like it.
Thank you.
Other comments, questions?
Yes, this is Pat Jones Macklin. Excuse me because I'm sounding a little nasal tonight, but I was listening to this charter school discussion and I had to come into it because I think the charter school that is being described in Oklahoma, what was it, the Comanche
Academy.
Comanche Academy. That's different. And I don't want people here to get in love with charter schools because your charter school is focused on something. We have so many charter schools in just in our city, and actually in the Black community that's not focusing on anything. You know, people just put their kids in charter school because they think it's better than public school. And then there's a lot of debate about it. And I'm not on to debate charter schools, and it is public school money being given to private schools. I think your charter school may serve a specific and unique purpose, but a lot of these schools are run by big business. They're nothing but business, and our children are the little customers. But I don't say that for yours because it sounds like the way you described it, that it is something that's needed for your community and it's dealing with a culture, the Comanche culture. So I just had to say that because I may not, other people may disagree. I'm not a charter school proponent, and I will let people know that. But I just think what you're doing is a little different.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. But we would not be able to do this if there wasn't a charter school law here in the state of Oklahoma that allows the legislation of sovereign nations, and there's 39 here in Oklahoma that would like to be the authorizer or the sponsor of such charter school. I don't think other states in the country have that type of legislation. And so when I saw that, I jumped on that, tried to take advantage of that, and then moved forward with our tribal leaders. And so we have that in place. This is our first year. It's a difficult year, you know, starting any kind of school, but especially under COVID-19 conditions. It is so traumatic that we're just trying to finish this first year so we can have our second year and then grow and expand. So I appreciate your sentiments and your support.
Other comments, questions? I can't believe people are being so quiet.
I have a question.
Please.
For either Cornel or Sam, or maybe both. I should tell you, I'm in Minneapolis and I'm just kind of listening because I have the privilege of knowing that this is going on. But given that the aim after these discussions is a bill about reparations, I'm wondering if you could say something more about how what Cornel is talking about tonight in terms of the reframing of the dialogue might move us in that direction of taking seriously and supporting legislation, or in whatever other way we can, this the seriousness of taking reparations seriously.
That's happening in Canada, and it is a good talking point, but a lot of the First Nations peoples and the leaders, the tribal leaders, did not see the elected national leadership become transparent when they became engaged in and when it became in reconciliation. So that we have to go and have that conversation in a very serious way, and that everybody is there, everybody is really concerned and transparent, and you move forward in that conversation and that discourse. So, you know, that comes from building trust in community and growing and expanding together. So I admire and applaud whoever's effort that is. And Dwayne, may I add that when I was a younger man, I created a brand new school in St. Paul at the Mounds Park All Nations Magnet School. And are you familiar with that school in St. Paul, Dwayne?
No, I'm sorry to say I'm not, but that sounds wonderful.
Yeah,
I'm more familiar with there is a charter school, or I don't know if it's even a charter school. It's just a public school here in Minneapolis that's directed towards Native American students.
Well,
I'm not sure it's entirely on the base of the Comanche Academy, but
no,
it's
no.
in that direction.
Yeah, it's called Mounds. It's in Dayton's Bluff. So what happened in the 1990s, that the Native kids were so bad in academics, so bad in participation, so bad in so many aspects, that the Native parents came together, both in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, and went to their respective superintendents and says, if you cannot improve Indian education in your public school, we're going to create our own schools. And a lot of times they did. The Heart of the Earth AIM School started. It doesn't exist anymore in Minneapolis. That was a private school. In St. Paul created the Red Schoolhouse. That was another AIM school. And that one didn't last either. But the compromise for the two superintendents in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, that they would design a charter school with a Native American focus. And I became the principal of the one in St. Paul because I had been a principal before and I knew about holistic design. So I got with the local communities, well, which were the Dakota, the Ho-Chunk, and the Anishinaabe. And those communities furnished their own language speakers. And so that was our base for those cultural groups. And it was open to everybody. It was open to a public. So all ethnic groups came there, but it was predominantly Dakota, Anishinaabe, and Ho-Chunk. And we turned around the test scores in 2 years, Dwayne.
That's amazing.
2 years, because of that holistic design and commitment by these teachers. It's kind of like the Jaime Escalante story, where he turned around his school in so quick a time that people that were skeptical of the Hispanic community in California thought he was cheating, because these were Hispanic kids, and how dare they excel academically. And so that's the story of where we were in St. Paul in 1990, 91, 92, 93, and just turned things around. And Dwayne, it still exists today. I'm so proud.
I'll look it up. But that goes to the capacity building that all of this, especially your talk about reconciliation, is really about.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, my friends?
Sam has a question.
I was going to ask you, I appreciate somebody introducing reparations into this conversation. And I would like to move to address this question based on the land issue. It seems to me like that there was somebody here when the Europeans came, and the Europeans took the land. Am I right or wrong, Cornel?
Well, The
And
land,
if that's the case, what is the reparatory position toward the land? I mean, I have members of St. Mark's Church, I remember, who had land in Oklahoma, and tried to reclaim it.
well, there's a big movement called Land Back. And it is all about, investigating stolen land that was legislated, land that came, like here in Oklahoma, it was legislated, but it was territories in reservation land by treaties, and treaties were signed, treaties were broken, treaties were misguided because our leadership system was not European. We didn't have just one chief. We had plenty of leaders that made decisions for the whole. But the way that the government came in is they tried to get as many leaders to sign their papers, and it caused feuds within our communities, in our bands and our clans, because many of them were treaty signers and many of them were not treaty signers, and it caused bloodshed amongst our people, and they were all family, and they couldn't understand why they acquired the land in an authorized way, and it wasn't done within the governance clanship of the way we are structured our tribal decisions. So I just thought I'd share that with you. There's that restoring of our own land and land back. And so many communities are starting to donate and give back our own land. And that's where a lot of reparations can happen. The land is being donated back to the original landowners.
How does that happen?
Actually, a lot of, like for our nations, for the command, many of us we're buying back our own land because we have enough economic development that can do that. Many of our nations are driven by the tribal casinos that are able to produce, the dollars and the funds and the revenue to buy back our own land.
But the land was stolen in the first place.
Yeah, well, that's where investigation, that's where our legal counsel comes into play, because they do the investigation for all these broken treaties.
And y'all trust the people you're negotiating with?
Well, we have to make a relationship with them. We have to make a relationship with them because, that trust comes hard, just like anything else. I mean, just look at yourself. I tell the story about how Sam Mann, I said, can I ask you that question a long time ago? I said, Sam, you're a white man. You've been a pastor in a Black church for all these decades. I mean, how many years did it take for your Black congregation to accept you? I think you said, I think the first 8-9 years was a warm-up year, meaning that you're there for the good of the people. I mean, that's what I meant by making a trust relationship with people that have the ownership of those lands at this day and age.
All right, we got a couple more questions here. Someone raised their hand, as well as Michael had also had a question as well.
Are you waiting for me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. My question is to Cornel. I was looking for an opportunity to bring this up, and I think you opened the door to that. When you talked about the problem of land and the treaties, with so many people signing, there were treaty signers, and then there were not treaty signers from the leaders. And it seems to me that division was taken advantage of by the leaders of America. And I think that still exists today. And I say it in this sense. Reparations. I mean, the indigenous people asking for reparations, but so are African Americans. And so my question to you is, have you or anybody that you know tried to join up with African Americans for a general understanding of reparations? And I say that in this sense. Are you familiar with Brian Stevenson? I'm sure you are. He's been working very diligently about the problems of slavery in America. And he's been putting up different signs where things happen and in terms of lynching in America. And he talks about reparations as well. And so I think the opportunity would increase for success in reparations, at least for the general concept of why reparations, whether you're talking about land or whether you're talking about people. And I think if there was a connection between indigenous people and African American across the country, it would give a larger platform for that conversation. So are you familiar with anything in that area?
Yeah, I'm familiar with that battle. Is this Lewis?
Yes, this is Lewis.
Lewis, yeah. You know, I come out of higher education from being a practitioner, but here in the state of Oklahoma is very colonial in its higher educational institutions. And they're very reluctant to host any kind of discussion such as this about reparations. I mean, anything about diversity, there seems to be a hesitancy, and I mean, it's like feel-good diversity. They like it when, you know, we talk and we buddy up, but when we get deep into the construct of race, then there seems to be this uneasiness, and then all of a sudden, some of the people start to fade and not committed to the discourse. And that seems to happen here in these institutions in Southwest Oklahoma. And there's not that many colleges and universities that we can have public space to even host such an event. We'd love to, but you know, it's like those of concern, conscious of a concern will come, but most of the people, which includes our own people that are colonized, will be very reluctant to have a conversation about reparations, about land back, about social justice and things like that, because of that's not a safe place that they've ever been. And and then we fight hard to even request space to have that conversation on our campuses that are not friendly. They're not friendly to diversity, and they're certainly not Native friendly.
Okay, well, that's expected at university. I've done some university work myself. So if you really want something done, you have to create your own platform.
Yes.
Because they will always use excuses for the, being run by the institution as reasons for not doing it. So if you're waiting for universities to do it, then it will never, ever happen.
Yeah.
So this type of thing is just like any civil rights movement. It has to start with the people.
Yes, very much so, very much so. And then, of course, we have advocates like our governor that are very, I don't mind saying it, anti-Indian, even though he's a card-carrying Cherokee Nation citizen, but that his accent or his focus is Oklahoma sovereignty. My focus is Comanche sovereignty. It is sovereignty because this is our tribal land. This is where it's from the get-go. We're not going anywhere. We share it with our allies and our partners, but we have to have a reconciliation within our school system so we can tell our story. Right now, the empire is striking back with critical race theory because they don't want to hear our side of the history.
Well, they don't want to hear the truth. It's not so much your side or anybody else's side. They don't want to hear the truth. And I think it was Tex who was talking earlier, looking for a platform. And I say, start one, Tex. Start a platform of your own for discussion on race and these issues. And you will have some people join you.
Yes, very much so. Thank you so much. Louis.
Mr. Anderson, we're trying to do that. We did a course on critical race theory. What was that? 4 months, 5 months, whatever it was ago. And this is another piece of that. And we're very interested in pursuing this. Thank you.
Are you in Kansas City?
Yes.
Okay, well, I'd like to connect with you. I'm in Kansas City as well.
I'd love it. If I put my phone number in the tech chat, would that be good?
That would be perfect.
I'll do it.
Thank you.
I'm going to let everybody have it because I don't know how to do it individually.
I believe Michael had a question.
Yes, this is Michael in Nebraska, and thank you to both of our presenters and all of you that have made this possible. I'm sitting here processing the question from the older white lady that commented about sending her grandchildren to learn at the Cherokee school and that type of thing. A place I have taken my grandkids to, and I know I'm closer here in Nebraska than you are in the Kansas City area, but is the Crazy Horse Memorial that Korshak started there a number of years ago in Custer, South Dakota. And Korshak made a promise that he would not take any government money. You could call that reparations if you wanted to, but he didn't trust the government to follow through with what they might promise. And but so he's done it all with private funds, and as a result, some look at the mountain and they say, God, there's not a whole lot done since I was last there. Well, that's not true. They'll take you through the history of the film menu and show what it's doing. But I learned a lot from going there. Mr. Z was gone by the time I made my first trip, but Mrs. Z was there. And I hope that some of you have been to Custer, South Dakota and visited Crazy Horse Memorial. We've been back there many times, a lot more than we've been to Rushmore, because Korshak and the Korshak family have worked hard to tell the story of the Native people and have done some and did a lot of work to help educate and advocate and give Native folk, young folk, summer education and also a lot of work and bring in a lot of artisans and that type of thing. Curious how many of you have been there?
I have been. Thank you for bringing it up and telling the story.
Glad to see Texas hand raised there too. We haven't been there since the pandemic, but have a retired preacher friend that has a hospitality ministry up there. And she told me when she retired from Nebraska, she says, Michael, we want you to come up and visit, but you got to know it's not going to be free. We got to pay our bills. Well, how much is it going to cost? Well, she says, I don't know. And now every time we go up, she has to figure again what it costs. And she has been working with BR&B now also. And so she's doing quite well. And it's a ministry for her. And thank you.
Others? We're trying to make sure people get their questions in that haven't spoken, so please speak up.
Well, I'll speak up and ask. This is Donna. I'm in Kansas City. We are sitting about 4 or 5 blocks away from the Shawnee Indian Mission School that was initiated back in the days by, if I'm not wrong, Tex, the Methodist. It was Methodist run, and it is now a National Historic place, and a nonprofit organization that does, quite a bit in terms of history. I have to say I'm not terribly familiar with the details of all their programs, but my question is, are you aware of some of these old Indian schools, so to speak, that you were talking about, that have been repurposed in a way, or that have kind of turned their stories around to become educational centers of any kind?
I know that this past year there has been a study by the Secretary of Interior, I forget her name, from New Mexico, that did a investigation about the not just the boarding schools, but the mission schools that had Native kids go there, because what they were looking at was the grave sites. But I'm sure that there's the historian or a book that talks about the Shawnee Mission Indian School and its purpose. And then from there, I think you could find valuable information and follow up. Probably this study, which is almost complete, will have portions of that that they might be able to share with you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
In Dallas, is there, in Kansas City, is there cooperation or animosity between the Indigenous reparations and the African American reparations movements?
Is that question for a Sandman or a Tex?
It's, I don't know.
Whoever knows
Or
the
you.
answer.
Oh, okay.
Whoever knows.
Well, if it's for me, I don't know that it's ever been broached between the two communities. I know as we talk tonight, there seem to be different approaches. And as a white man, I would hesitate to even step into that to that dialogue at this point.
How I could respond is saying that here in my city, Lawton, Oklahoma, I've been appointed to the Mayor's Commission on Race Relations. And that is my first exposure to many of the leaders within not only the churches, but the schools and these institutions of public service. And it's my way to connect with them to build allegiance and allies. And so for me, being the leader of the Indigenous Peoples Committee locally, we're planning a powwow in this fall for Indigenous Peoples Day. And we plan to invite some of the local churches, the Black churches, and we want to celebrate together Juneteenth and have a powwow on Juneteenth in solidarity with our Black brothers and sisters and share our community histories in one day of celebration of dance and food. So that is our way to share in solidarity the efforts of repatriation.
Well, and the reason for my silence was exactly the one that Sam spoke to, that it's not for me as a white person to speak to that. I can say this: I've been to over 340 meetings of the Urban Summit, which is a major Black advocacy group in the city under the leadership of Bishop James Tyndall. I have never, ever heard one negative word toward the Native American community in any of those meetings. And I also am a member of the Black Baptist Ministers Union, And I've never heard in those meetings a single negative reference to Native American peoples. So I can say that much. We've got about 5 minutes. Does somebody have a just burning question?
What I'd like to do, Tex, is could I sing a song?
Oh, I'd love it.
Okay. Like I said, I remember civil rights, and I remember working with many people in my community, but because of solidarity in higher education, I reached out to a lot of brothers and sisters of all colors, one of which is Sam Mann, but also one of my elders from the Black community. His name is Asa Hilliard, the senior.
Yes.
Asa had a vision like I do, and he understood repatriation like I do. He understands the soul wound like I do. He understands racism like I did. And so we met over and over at educational conferences, and we had a consciousness that was raising, and is very critical. And so we went respectively back to our communities and started our work. So I earned a lot of knowledge from my mentor, my friend Asa, in his book. I still have it today. It's let me see. He's passed on, but I carry his spirit with me. But that's what I mean. We build these sisterhoods and brotherhoods out of the companionship of our time together, and we try to be as spiritual as we can. But in that spirit, I like to sing one song, and it's the theme for the American Indian movement, because I remember that distinctively. And the people that I admire, many of the early AIM people, they've moved on. And I still pray, and I hope that someday that I will see Leonard Peltier released from prison.
Amen.
I would like to see him. He invited me to his place where he was at the penitentiary in Leavenworth when I lived in Kansas. And
yes.
I had a good talk with him. He was concerned about Indigenous education at that. And I told him, he said, tell me, what is the status of Indian education in this country? And I told him, and he got sad. He says, I don't want you to stop what you're doing. You need to continue the work of self-determination for our people, and that is the hope. So with those words, I still hold it true to myself in the kind of work that I try to carry on for those people that I admire. So
Cornel?
Yes.
This is Sam. St. Mark's was the location of the national headquarters for the Free Leonard Peltier movement. So many of the time, but thank you for bringing his name to the table. I was trying to figure out how to do that, and you did. And he's certainly one of the great political leaders.
Oh, excuse me, Sam.
I was moved by. I was hoping Cornel would play his flute, but I see he's got his drum.
I'll play my flute later, but this song is in the spirit of Leonard Peltier. It's the American Indian movement song. just one time through, I didn't want to make it a real long song, but the meaning behind that is the spirit and the intent of the American Indian movement in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s that tried to fight the good fight and really opened the door for a Native American studies in the takeover at Alcatraz Island. And out of that was born the scholarship of Native American studies. And so as a professor emeritus in Native American studies, I owe it to those that have dedicated their lives that made this happen. So that's how I wanted to conclude my talk today and share it with my brothers and sisters and allies. And I thank you so much, Tex. Thank you, Brother Sam Mann. Thank you, my brothers and sisters in the audience. And please, let's stay in touch for the good work that we're doing.
Just want to thank you, Dr. Pewewardy, for this session this time. It has been rich, and we are indeed very grateful for your presence. And thank you, Dr. Mann, Brother Sam, for your invitation to Dr. Pewewardy and for your continuing work with us. Sam, would you say just a quick word about who's next week?
Next week is Reparations. Kamm Howard, head of the National Reparations Movement, will be our speaker. We're indeed very fortunate to have someone of such great caliber to speak to us, and a great leader in the whole notion of reparations. And what a great way to end this one on history, talking about reparations. Got to be something spiritual in here, Cornel.
We've had two great sessions. We're looking for another two great ones. So hope you'll be with us. Thank you very much. We'll conclude with this. Again, thank you, Dr. Pewewardy.